My name is Harriet, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about keys and children and the quiet, creeping way the world tries to make you disappear when you get to a certain age. I'm 72 now, and for most of my life, I believed that love was a fortress. It turns out, sometimes it's just a beautifully decorated cage, and the people you love most are the ones holding the key. It started with my car keys, then the house keys, sometimes the little key to the garden shed. I've never been a meticulously organized person. My mind, even as a girl, was always a whirlwind of ideas, a library with 1,000 books open at once. My late husband, George, used to laugh about it. He'd find the television remote in the refrigerator and just shake his head, a little smile playing on his lips. Harriet, he'd say, your mind is too full of poetry to worry about prose. He made it sound romantic. My children, Mark and Cynthia, made it sound like a disease. The laughter changed first. It used to be a shared, gentle joke. Mom's lost her keys again. One of them would announce, and we'd all spend 5 minutes patting down cushions and checking coat pockets until they turned up, usually in the pocket of the apron I'd just taken off. But over the last year, the laughter grew thin, brittle. It became a performance, a knowing look exchanged between my son and daughter over my head, as if I were a toddler who'd done something predictably silly. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes anymore. Instead, their eyes held a look of clinical assessment, of appraisal. The inciting incident, the moment the curtain was pulled back to reveal the ugly machinery backstage, happened on a Tuesday. It was my grandson Leo's 8th birthday. Cynthia was hosting a small party at her house, one of those sprawling, sterile new builds that always smelled faintly of paint and debt. I had baked a lemon drizzle cake, Leo's favorite, using the same recipe my own mother had used. The cake was in a carrier on my passenger seat, and I was ready to go, but my car keys were gone. Not on the hook by the door, not in my purse, not on the kitchen counter. I checked all the usual absurd places, the freezer, the laundry basket, the bookshelf. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at my skin. I couldn't be late. Cynthia gets a particular kind of tight-lipped fury when her meticulously planned schedules are disrupted. I called her. Cynthia, darling, I'm so sorry. I seem to have misplaced my keys. I'm looking everywhere. I'll be there as soon as I can. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, thick with disappointment. It wasn't the warm, understanding silence of a daughter. It was the cold, impatient silence of a manager whose employee has just messed up. Again, Mom? Leo's friends are arriving. Just get a cab. We'll sort this out later. Click. She didn't even say goodbye. I found them, of course. 20 minutes later, they were on the patio table, right next to the pot of geraniums I'd been meaning to water. I must have set them down when I went outside to check the weather. I drove to Cynthia's house, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the lemon drizzle cake mocking me from the passenger seat. I walked in, and the party noise fell away for a second. Every head turned. Mark was there, standing beside his sister, and they both wore the same expression. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was pity, mingled with a grim sort of triumph. Later, as I was cutting the cake, I heard them in the hallway. They were whispering, but in a house with acoustics designed for echoing children's laughter, their words carried perfectly. This is the final straw, Mark. Cynthia's voice was a low hiss. She was almost half an hour late. What if it was something important? What if she'd left the stove on? I know. Mark's voice was just as low, just as venomous. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. It's a classic sign. The repetition, the memory gaps. It's cognitive decline. We have to be responsible. Cognitive decline. The words hung in the air, like poison gas. They weren't talking about me, Harriet, their mother. They were talking about a diagnosis, a set of symptoms, a problem to be managed. They ambushed me a few days later. They called it a family meeting, which was always a bad sign. It meant they wanted something. They sat on my floral sofa, the one George and I had picked out 30 years ago, and they looked so out of place, so severe in their dark, sensible clothes. Cynthia had a folder on her lap. Mark cleared his throat, assuming the role of spokesman he always took. "Mom," he began, his voice oozing a syrupy, false sincerity that turned my stomach. "Cynthia and I are worried about you." "We love you," Cynthia chimed in, placing a cold hand on my arm. "And because we love you, we have to be proactive. We've noticed you've been struggling a bit lately, with little things, the keys, appointments." "So," Mark continued, leaning forward, "we took the liberty of scheduling an appointment for you, with a specialist, a geriatrician, just to get a baseline, to see where things stand." Cynthia opened her folder. It was a brochure. On the front was a picture of a smiling silver-haired woman looking thoughtfully at a chessboard. "Her name is Dr. Elise Reed," she said. "She's the best in the field. We just want to make sure you have the best care." I sat there, frozen. It was all so rehearsed, so clinical. They weren't asking me. They were informing me. And then came the real reason, the rotten core of it all. "And Mom," Mark said, his eyes flicking for a moment toward the antique secretary desk, where I kept my financial papers, "if things are becoming a bit much to handle, we want you to know we're here to help. We can help manage things. Your accounts, the bills, just to take the pressure off." There it was. The glint of greed in their eyes was unmistakable. They didn't see their mother. They saw a portfolio. They saw an inheritance. They were afraid might be mismanaged, or, God forbid, spent. They weren't scheduling a doctor's appointment. They were laying the groundwork for a hostile takeover of my life. They were hoping for a diagnosis, a piece of paper that would give them the one thing they truly craved: power of attorney. They wanted to declare me incompetent so they could control the very funds George and I had worked our entire lives to build. And as I looked at my two beautiful children, the children I had rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers, I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with age. It was the chilling, stark realization of betrayal. The fortress of love hadn't just been breached, it had been a mirage all along. After they left, the silence they left behind in my little house was a physical thing. It was heavier than grief, colder than winter. I walked from room to room, touching the frames of photographs on the wall. There was Mark, age 5, beaming with a missing front tooth, holding up a finger painting he'd made for me. There was Cynthia, age 12, in her ballet costume, her face a mask of fierce concentration before her first recital. And there I was in every picture, just at the edge of the frame, my face glowing with a pride that felt in this new harsh light, utterly naive. I sank into George's old armchair, the worn leather sighing under my weight. The smell of his pipe tobacco still clung to it faintly, a ghost of a scent, and in that moment, the dam I had built inside me for years finally broke. I wept, not loud, theatrical sobs, but the quiet, gut-wrenching tears of a woman who has just realized she is utterly, completely alone. They weren't just my children. They were my life's work. I had poured everything I was, everything I had, into them, and in return they saw me as an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved. My mind, the very mind they sought to label as deficient, began to unspool the past. It wasn't a jumble. It was a clear, itemized list of receipts for a debt of gratitude that had never been paid. It was a highlight reel of my own foolish, boundless generosity. I remembered Mark's first brilliant business idea, just after he dropped out of college, a gourmet hot dog truck. He called it the Gilded Wiener. He was so passionate, so convincing, he needed $20,000 for the truck and the permits. George, who was still with me then, had been skeptical. Harriet, the boy can't even make toast without burning it. This is a bad idea. But I saw the desperation in Mark's eyes, the fear of being a failure. I gave him the money from my personal savings, the nest egg my own parents had left me. I told myself it was an investment in my son's future. The Gilded Wiener lasted 3 months. I never saw a dime of that money again. When I gently asked about it a year later, he'd laughed it off. "Oh, Mom, come on. That was seed money. You can't expect a return on seed money." He said it as if I were the silly one for even asking. Then came Cynthia's wedding. George was gone by then, taken by a sudden, brutal heart attack that had left a hole in my life the size of the sky. I was still reeling, still navigating the world as a solo act, when Cynthia announced her engagement. She wanted a fairy tale wedding, not just a nice wedding, but a spectacle, a string quartet, a 5-course meal for 200 guests, a Vera Wang dress that cost more than my first car. She presented me with a budget that made my head spin. "I know it's a lot, Mom," she'd said, her eyes welling with strategic tears, "but it's what Daddy would have wanted." She knew exactly which button to press. The guilt, the grief, the desire to give my fatherless daughter the world. It was a potent cocktail. I liquidated a portion of the stocks George had so carefully cultivated. I wrote the checks, and through the whole process, she treated me not like the generous benefactor I was, but like an incompetent event planner. She criticized the calligrapher I hired. She complained that the shade of ivory in the linens wasn't warm enough. On her wedding day, she looked like a princess. She barely spoke 2 words to me. As I sat alone at my table, watching her dance with her new husband, I felt a pang of something I couldn't name then, but recognized now. I was a walking, talking ATM, a utility. These were the big things, the grand gestures of my parental folly. But it was the 1,000 little cuts that had done the most damage. It was the assumption that I was always available to babysit, my own plans easily discarded. It was the way they'd borrow my car for the weekend and bring it back with the gas tank on empty. It was the endless stream of links they'd send me for their children's fundraising drives, school trips, and sports teams, never once asking if I could afford it, always assuming I would provide. I was the family safety net, the eternal provider, the quiet, reliable son around which their chaotic lives revolved, and I had allowed it. I had cultivated it. My justification, my mantra through it all, was a promise I'd made to George on his deathbed. "Take care of the kids, Harriet," he'd whispered, his hand weak in mine. "They'll need you." I had interpreted his words as a command to enable them, to shield them from every consequence, to be their endless resource. I thought it was my duty. I now saw it was my undoing. The brochure they'd left on my coffee table caught my eye. Oakwood Meadows, a premier senior living community. On the cover, a group of unnaturally cheerful seniors played bocce ball on a pristine lawn. They all had the same placid, empty smiles. They looked content. They also looked weaponized. This was their vision for my future, a managed, sanitized existence in a holding pen for the elderly, where my only decision would be whether to have the chicken or the fish for dinner. It was the brochure that did it. It was the sheer, galling presumption of it. They had already decided my fate. They had written the final chapter of my life, and it was a tragedy of irrelevance. A different kind of fire began to burn in my chest, replacing the cold dread. It was a slow-burning rage, quiet and focused. My mind, which they so casually dismissed as failing, felt sharper and clearer than it had in years. The fog of grief and misplaced duty was finally lifting. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. I said, my voice steady, "Harriet, I was just thinking about you. How was the birthday party?" I took a deep breath. "Margaret, they're trying to have me declared incompetent." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Margaret's voice, sharp and furious, crackled down the line. "They what? Those ungrateful little vipers. Let me guess, this is about the money, isn't it? It's not about your keys, Harriet. It's about your key card to the bank." Hearing her say it, hearing the righteous anger in her voice, was like a splash of cold water. It validated the fury that was building in me. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what it's about." "Right," Margaret said. "All business now." She was a retired forensic accountant, and her mind was a fortress of logic and numbers. "First things first. You're going to that doctor's appointment. You're going to be charming and lucid, and you are going to ace whatever little tests they throw at you. Then you and I are going to have a long talk, with all of your financial statements, every last one." A small, unfamiliar smile touched my lips. It felt like stretching a muscle I hadn't used in decades. "Okay, Maggie," I said. "I'll do that." I hung up the phone. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a chessboard before the first move, the quiet of a hunter waiting in a blind. The path forward was no longer a sad, managed decline into obscurity. It was a warpath, and I was just getting started. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about survival. But I have to admit, as I looked at that condescending brochure, a new thought began to form, a delicious and daring idea that made my heart beat a little faster. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The day of the appointment, I dressed with purpose, not in my usual comfortable floral dress and cardigan, but in a tailored navy blue pantsuit I hadn't worn in years. I put on a string of pearls George had given me for our 30th anniversary. I styled my hair. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a forgetful old woman. I saw Harriet Thorne, a woman who had raised 2 children, managed a household, supported her husband's career, and navigated the labyrinth of widowhood with quiet dignity. I saw a woman who was about to fight for her life. Dr. Elise Reed's office was not what I expected. There were no patronizing posters of smiling seniors. It was a modern, clean space with abstract art on the walls and shelves filled with books, thick academic tomes on neurology and psychology. It felt serious. It felt respectful. Dr. Reed herself was a woman in her late 40s, with intelligent, kind eyes and a calm, direct manner that immediately put me at ease. She didn't speak to me in the slow, loud voice people sometimes use for the elderly. She spoke to me as an equal. "Harriet," she said, after shaking my hand firmly, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Your children expressed some concerns, but I find it's always best to hear things from the patient herself. So tell me, in your own words, how are you feeling?" And so I told her. I didn't mention my children's ambitions or the power of attorney. I simply told her the truth. I told her I'd always been a bit scattered, that my mind was a creative space, not a filing cabinet. I told her about the increasing pressure and the feeling of being watched and judged. I told her about the key incident. She listened intently, nodding, her gaze never leaving mine. "It sounds stressful," she said, and the simple validation in those 3 words almost made me cry. Then came the tests. It was a long afternoon, a marathon of cognitive assessments. There were memory tests, where I had to recall lists of words and complex stories. There were spatial reasoning puzzles, logic problems, and reaction time drills. At first, I was nervous, my palms sweating. The weight of my children's expectations felt like a physical presence in the room. But then a funny thing happened. I started to enjoy it. The logic puzzles were like the cryptic crosswords George and I used to do on Sunday mornings. The memory tests were a challenge, a game. My mind, the mind they thought was failing, rose to the occasion. It felt like blowing the dust off a powerful, finely tuned engine. I could feel the synapses firing, the connections clicking into place. I remembered the name of the fictional grocer in the story she told, his daughter's profession, and the price of the 3 items she bought. I breezed through the pattern recognition section. I realized with a jolt, having fun. A week later, I was back in her office for the results. I had brought a small notebook and a pen, a habit from a lifetime of being organized in my own way. Dr. Reed smiled as I sat down. "Well, Harriet," she began, "I have your results here. We ran a full neurological and cognitive workup. It's about as comprehensive as it gets." She paused, looking at me over her glasses. "To put it bluntly," she said, "your children's concerns are entirely unfounded. There is absolutely no evidence of cognitive decline. None. In fact, in several areas, particularly verbal memory and complex problem solving, your scores are significantly above average for your age group. You have what we call a high-functioning, highly active mind." Relief washed over me, so intensely I felt lightheaded. I had known it, deep down, but to have it confirmed, to have the data, the proof, it was everything. She continued, her voice softening. "What you do show signs of, however, is significant stress and anxiety, the kind that can manifest in forgetfulness. Forgetting where you put your keys isn't a sign that your brain is broken, Harriet. It's often a sign that your brain It's often a sign that your brain is overloaded. You're juggling too much, and your mind is prioritizing other things. From what you told me, it sounds like you're under a great deal of emotional strain." And that's when I broke. The composure I had maintained so carefully crumbled. I told her everything. The whispers about cognitive decline, the talk of power of attorney, the brochure for the senior living facility, the lifetime of being the family bank, the emotional bedrock, the unthanked provider. The story poured out of me, a torrent of frustration, hurt, and now a burning righteous anger. She listened without interruption, her expression a mixture of professional empathy and personal outrage. When I finished, my voice hoarse, she leaned forward. "Harriet," she said, and her voice was firm, "what you are describing is a classic and frankly ugly form of elder abuse. It's not physical, but it's an attempt to strip you of your autonomy based on a manufactured premise. It's about control, and it's about money. I see it more often than you can imagine." She then told me about her own grandmother, a vibrant woman who was an avid painter until her children decided she was too frail and moved her into a home where she wasn't allowed to have her turpentine and oils. They thought they were protecting her. Dr. Reed said, her eyes sad, but what they did was steal her joy. She passed away 6 months later. They said it was old age. I believe it was a broken heart. We talked for over an hour. We talked about ageism, about the way society renders older women invisible, their wisdom and experience devalued and dismissed as eccentricity or senility. She didn't treat me like a patient. She treated me like a contemporary, a peer. For the first time in a very long time, I felt seen, truly seen, for who I was, not for what I represented to others. I left her office that day, a different woman. I had a clean bill of mental health in my purse, and a fire in my belly. My first call was to Margaret. Maggie, I said, the moment she answered, the plan has changed. We met at her kitchen table that evening. I spread out the documents, bank statements, brokerage reports, the deed to my house. George had been a quiet, unassuming man, but he was a brilliant and patient investor. Our nest egg, the fund we called our rainy day fund, had been growing quietly and steadily for 40 years. My children, with their focus on my modest paid-off house and my 10-year-old car, had no idea of its true scale. They saw the life I lived, not the assets I held. They had committed the classic blunder of the greedy. They had underestimated their target. The portfolio was substantial, more than substantial. It was a formidable sum of money, the kind of money that could make things happen. Margaret whistled, a low, impressed sound, as she looked over the numbers. Good Lord, Harriet. You're not just solvent, you're a powerhouse. I know, I said, and my children want to get their hands on it by declaring me senile. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Not on my watch. She picked up her phone. I'm calling my lawyer. Her name is Miss Albright. She eats men like your son for breakfast, and she has a special distaste for grasping daughters like yours. The next day, I was sitting in a sleek, downtown law office. Miss Albright was a woman who radiated a terrifying competence. She was my age, with sharp silver hair and an even sharper mind. I explained the situation. She didn't seem surprised. A tale as old as time, she said, her fingers steepled. Children see parents, not as people, but as future inheritances. The moment they perceive a vulnerability, the jackals start to circle, so let's build you a fortress. And we did. Over the next week, we systematically dismantled any possible avenue of attack. We drafted a new, ironclad will that was a masterpiece of legal precision. We created a new living will, and most importantly, a durable power of attorney. I named Margaret as my primary agent, and Miss Albright as my secondary. Then came the part I savored most. We added a specific clause, in clear and unequivocal language. My children, Mark Thorne and Cynthia Mills, are to be expressly and irrevocably excluded from any and all fiduciary, medical or legal authority over my person or my estate, now and for all time. Miss Albright raised an eyebrow. That's quite definitive. It's meant to be, I said. With the legal fortress built, it was time to plan my offensive. I thought about what had hurt the most. It was the dismissal, the assumption that my mind, my very essence, was in decay. They had tried to use the concept of cognitive decline as a weapon against me. I decided then and there that I would turn that weapon back on them in the most poetic way imaginable. I would take the very thing they wanted, the money, and use it to champion the very thing they had tried to strip from me, my cognitive vitality. The idea, fully formed, bloomed in my mind. It was perfect, it was elegant, and it was going to be devastating. The first move in a quiet war is the most important one. It must be silent, decisive, and irreversible. Mine took the form of a phone call to the local university, an institution George and I had always supported in our own small way. I didn't ask for the alumni office. I asked for the Dean of Philanthropy. His name was Dean Carmichael, a man with a smooth professional voice that told me he spent his days asking people for money. I'm sure he expected a modest donation, perhaps a few $1,000s, to get my name on a brick in a campus walkway. I scheduled a meeting. Margaret came with me, not as my friend, but as my financial advisor. We needed to project an aura of unassailable competence. We were shown into a large, wood-paneled office. Dean Carmichael was exactly as I'd pictured, polished, polite, with a carefully calibrated smile. We engaged in the requisite small talk. He mentioned my long history of small donations to the arts program. Yes, I said, cutting gently to the chase. I've always believed in the power of the arts. But today, I'm interested in the sciences, specifically the science of the human mind. He leaned forward, his interest piqued. I have recently become acutely aware. I began, choosing my words with care, of the pervasive and damaging stereotypes surrounding aging and cognitive function. There's a societal rush to diagnose decline, to dismiss wisdom as senility, to pathologize the natural process of getting older. It's a prejudice that robs people of their dignity and their autonomy. The dean nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. That's a very insightful point, Mrs. Thorne. I don't just want to make a point, I said, leaning forward and meeting his gaze. I want to fund a solution. I am here today to propose endowing a new permanent research chair at this university. His professional smile widened slightly. A research chair is a wonderful legacy-making gift, Harriet. We would be honored. In what field? This was the moment. I took a deep breath. I want to establish the Dr. Elise Reed Chair for the study of cognitive vitality in aging. I watched his face. The name meant nothing to him, but the specificity of the title did. It wasn't just a donation, it was a mission statement. What a fascinating and vital area of study, he said carefully. An endowment for a full chair is, as you know, a significant commitment. I'm aware, I said. I slid a single piece of paper across the polished mahogany desk. It was a summary of the assets I intended to liquidate for the endowment. It was not a small number. Dean Carmichael picked up the paper. His eyes scanned it. I watched as his eyebrows climbed up his forehead and tried to take up residence in his hairline. The smooth professional mask fell away, replaced by a look of genuine slack-jawed astonishment. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper, as if he couldn't reconcile the quiet 72-year-old woman in the pantsuit with the staggering figure written in black ink. Thorne, he stammered, his voice an octave higher than it had been a moment before. This is transformative. This is one of the most significant single donations in the university's history. I want the research to focus on resilience, I said, pressing my advantage, on the factors that contribute to mental sharpness and intellectual engagement throughout a person's life. I want to combat the narrative of decay and replace it with a narrative of vitality. And I want the first holder of the chair to be Dr. Elise Reed herself, if she'll have it. The university, of course, was ecstatic. The paperwork was drawn up with lightning speed. Liquidating that much of the portfolio took a few days, and it set off a cascade of alerts. This was the part I was looking forward to. My phone started ringing. It was Mark. I let it go to voicemail. He called again and again. Then Cynthia started. I let her calls go to voicemail, too. Then came the texts. The first one was from Mark. Mom, are you okay? I'm seeing some strange activity in the brokerage account. Call me. I smiled and took a sip of my tea. An hour later, another text, this time from Cynthia. Her tone was already more frantic. Mom, seriously, what is going on? Huge amounts of money are being moved. Are you being scammed? Did someone get your passwords? You need to call us right now. The fake concern was so thin it was transparent. They weren't worried about me being scammed. They were worried about their inheritance being scammed. They were watching their golden goose fly away. I waited a few hours, letting them stew in their own greedy panic. Then I sent a single, simple text message back to both of them. Everything is perfectly fine, darlings. I'm simply making an investment in the future. I could almost hear the shriek of frustration from across town. I had given them just enough information to drive them insane. They knew something was happening, but they didn't know what. They knew the money was moving, but they didn't know where. I had cut them out of the information loop, and in doing so, I had taken my first real step in reclaiming my power. The silent takeover was underway, and the beautiful part was, they had no idea who the enemy was. They still thought they were fighting my cognitive decline. They had no idea they were actually fighting me. The days that followed were a masterclass in the escalation of panic. My phone became a constant buzz of their frantic attempts to regain control. The tone of their messages shifted dramatically, moving through the stages of manipulative grief. First came the feigned concern, laced with condescension. Mark left a voicemail that was a true work of art in passive aggression. "Mom, hi, it's me. Again, listen, I am getting seriously worried. This isn't like you, making massive financial decisions without talking to anyone. It's exactly the kind of thing Dr. Reed needs to know about. Please, just call me back. We're on your side here. On my side." The lie was so bald it was almost funny. Then came the anger. Cynthia, always the more direct of the two, didn't bother with the pretense. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she texted, the lack of punctuation speaking volumes. "That is family money. You have no right to just throw it away on some investment. You are being incredibly irresponsible and selfish. Family money, the nerve of it. It was my money, George's and my money, earned through his 45 years at the engineering firm and my careful, frugal management of our household. They had contributed nothing to it but a constant, draining withdrawal. I ignored them all. My silence was a wall they couldn't breach, and it was driving them mad. Their world had been built on a foundation of my predictability, my accessibility, my eternal willingness to answer their call. By simply refusing to engage, I had fundamentally altered the landscape of our relationship. I had taken away their power, and they were flailing. The climax of their desperation came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my garden, humming to myself and repotting my orchids when Cynthia's expensive SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. She stormed up the walkway, her face a mask of thunder, a leather-bound folio clutched in her hand like a weapon. She didn't bother to knock, just pushed the front door open. "Mom," she yelled, her voice echoing in the quiet house. I walked in from the back porch, wiping dirt from my hands onto my apron. I stood there, calm and silent, and waited. "I have tried calling you. I have tried texting you," she said, her voice rising with each word. "You have left me no choice. I need to see all of your financial records. Right now, I need to see what you've done." She was treating me like a recalcitrant teenager, an employee caught embezzling. I looked at her, at my daughter, her face twisted with an ugly sense of entitlement, and I felt a profound and final wave of pity for her. Not for her situation, but for the person she had become. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through her tirade like a shard of glass. She stopped, stunned. "What did you say?" I said no. I repeated, a little louder this time. "My finances are my own private business, Cynthia. They do not concern you. You are a guest in my home, and right now, you are being a very rude one. I think you should leave." Her jaw dropped. In 42 years, I had never spoken to her like that. I had always been the peacemaker, the accommodator, the one who smoothed things over. She looked at me as if I had grown a second head. She sputtered for a moment, trying to find a foothold, a way to reassert her dominance. She found none. The ground had shifted beneath her feet. Defeated, she turned and marched out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the silence, my heart hammering, but not from fear. It was the thrill of victory. I had held my ground. I had drawn a boundary, and for the first time, I had enforced it. Mark's attempt was less dramatic, but equally revealing. He tried to go through official channels. I got a call later that day from a young man at my bank. "Mrs. Thorne, this is Kevin from the downtown branch. I'm just calling to verify some information. We received a call from a Mr. Mark Thorne, who identified himself as your son. He expressed some concerns that you might be the victim of fraud and asked for a temporary freeze to be placed on your accounts pending a family review." Miss Albright had prepared me for this. "And what did you tell him, Kevin?" I asked, my voice as sweet as honey. "Well, Mrs. Thorne, as Mr. Thorne does not have power of attorney or any legal standing on your accounts, I informed him that we could not discuss your financial information with him due to privacy regulations. He was quite insistent." "I'm sure he was," I said. "Thank you for your diligence, Kevin. And please make a note in my file. Under no circumstances is anyone from my family to be given any information or authority regarding my accounts. All inquiries are to be directed to my lawyer, Miss Albright. Do you have her number?" I gave him the number. The fortress was holding. My children, who had assumed they could simply walk in and take over, were finding every door locked, every window barred. They were outside, in the cold, looking in at a world they no longer controlled. Their panic was morphing into a desperate, sputtering rage. They had lost their leverage, their access, and their imagined authority. The power had shifted, silently and completely, and they were the last ones to realize the new reality. The game had changed, and they didn't even know the new rules. The final act of my little drama was not orchestrated by me, but by the slow, grinding gears of public relations. The university, eager to celebrate its massive new endowment, sent out a press release. It was a well-crafted piece, full of laudatory language about philanthropy, forward-thinking science, and community partnership. It was picked up by the local newspaper's website and the city's business journal, and it contained 3 key pieces of information: my name as the donor, the name of the new chair, the Dr. Elise Reed Chair for the Study of Cognitive Vitality in Aging, and of course the full eye-watering amount of the endowment. I imagine Mark saw it first. He's the type to have Google alerts set up for his own name. Or maybe Cynthia stumbled upon it while scrolling through her social media feed. However it happened, the result was the same. The mystery was solved. The vague, terrifying investment I had made was no longer an unknown. It was a headline, and it was a headline that starred the name of the very specialist they had chosen to be the instrument of my downfall. The sheer brutal poetry of it must have felt like a physical blow. It didn't take long for them to arrive. I was sitting on my front porch, in the comfortable wicker chair George had loved, sipping a tall glass of iced tea. Margaret was with me, sitting in the matching chair, a book in her lap. We were waiting for them. We knew they would come. Mark's car, a pompous German sedan, pulled up first, followed closely by Cynthia's white SUV. They got out of their cars and marched up my lawn in a unified front of outrage. They didn't even use the walkway. They stomped across the grass as if they owned it. They stopped at the foot of the porch steps, their faces pale and tight with fury. "How could you?" Mark's voice was a strangled whisper. He was holding his phone, the screen glowing with the news article. Cynthia found her voice first, and it was a shriek. "Are you insane? That was our money. That was our inheritance. You took our future, and you gave it to a complete stranger, to the doctor." They started talking over each other then, a frantic, ugly duet of greed and betrayal. All those years we were counting on that. "Do you have any idea what this means for us? You've ruined us, our money, our inheritance." They said the words without a trace of shame. They finally admitted what this had always been about. I let them go on. I let them empty themselves of all their poison, all their selfish, grasping rage. I watched them, and I felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. They looked so small, so pathetic, standing there on my lawn, throwing a tantrum because their trust fund had been diverted. When they finally paused, breathless and red-faced, I took a slow sip of my iced tea. I set the glass down carefully on the small table between Margaret and me. The clink of the glass on the wood was the only sound. First, I said, my voice calm and even, it was never your money. It was my money, earned by my husband's hard work and protected by my prudence. An inheritance is not a right, it is a gift you have proven beyond any doubt that you do not deserve. I looked from Mark's shocked face to Cynthia's. You talk about strangers, I continued, my voice gaining strength. For the past few years, you are the ones who have become strangers to me. My children would never have looked at me with such cold calculation. My children would never have whispered about my cognitive decline as a strategy to seize control of my assets. The two of you, standing there, are strangers who happen to share my DNA. I stood up, walking to the edge of the porch, looking down on them. You sent me to Dr. Elise Reed, hoping she would give you a weapon. You wanted a diagnosis, a label, a medical justification to take over my life. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable. She gave me validation. She saw a person, not a problem. She saw a mind, not a balance sheet. So no, I didn't give my money to a stranger. I gave it to the one person in this entire sordid affair who treated me with dignity and respect. I invested in her. I invested in her vision of a world that doesn't discard its elders like worn-out furniture. I let that sink in. Their faces were blank with disbelief. They had no response. Their arguments, built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, had crumbled to dust. You were so concerned about my cognitive vitality, I said, delivering the final blow. Well, you should be proud. Your concern directly inspired this endowment. You wanted to pathologize my age, so I decided to fund the study of its strength. You wanted power of attorney over my life, so I exercised my power of attorney over my own assets to build a legacy of empowerment for others. In a way, this is all because of you. This is your legacy too, the legacy of your own greed. They just stood there, speechless, defeated. All the fight had gone out of them, replaced by a hollow, gaping understanding of their powerlessness. Now, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dismissive tone, I believe you were just leaving. I turned my back on them, walked back to my chair, and sat down. Margaret looked at me, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. I heard their car doors slam. I heard the sound of their engines as they drove away out of my life. The house was quiet again, but this quiet was different. It wasn't the lonely quiet of betrayal. It was the vast, peaceful, and deeply satisfying quiet of victory. Life is different now. It's quieter, but it's a richer, more vibrant quiet. I don't jump every time the phone rings. The mail brings university newsletters and invitations, not brochures for assisted living facilities. I accepted a position on the advisory board for the new research chair. I sit in a room with brilliant minds, neurologists, sociologists, and they listen to my opinions. They value my life experience. They see me. Dr. Reed, Elise as she insists I call her, has become a dear friend. We have lunch once a month. We talk about the research her team is doing, about books, about art, about life. She told me the endowment has already attracted 2 of the top researchers in the field. They're studying the link between creative pursuits and neuroplasticity in seniors. I feel a thrill every time she tells me this, a sense of having planted a tree that will shelter people for generations to come. Last spring, on a whim, I enrolled in a creative writing class at the university. I'm finally writing down the poems that have been swirling in my head my whole life. I'm not just a subject of study, I'm a student. My world, which my children tried to shrink to the size of a single room, has expanded. It's bigger and more full of possibility than it has ever been. I don't hear from Mark or Cynthia. The grapevine, which in a small town is always rustling, has brought me news. Mark's latest entrepreneurial venture, some sort of cryptocurrency consulting firm, collapsed. He had to sell his big German car. Cynthia and her husband had to cancel the grand tour of Europe they'd been planning. They had to take out a second mortgage on their sterile new-build house. These aren't acts of my revenge. They are simply the natural consequences of a life lived without a safety net. The Bank of Mom is permanently closed. I want to talk to you for a moment. To you who might be feeling invisible, dismissed, or underestimated. They say that revenge is a dish best served cold. I've come to believe that's not quite right. True vindication isn't a dish you serve to others at all. It's a feast you prepare for yourself. What I did wasn't really about punishing my children. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. They tried to write an ending for me, a sad little story of decline and dependency. I simply took the pen back and wrote a better one. Never let anyone, not your family, not society, not the passage of years, convince you that your story is over. Your value does not diminish with age. It compounds like a well-managed portfolio. Your experiences, your wisdom, your resilience, that is your true wealth. Guard it fiercely, invest it wisely, and never ever give anyone else the power to write your final chapter. Your life is your story. Make sure it's a masterpiece. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, please share your own experiences in the comments below. Your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. And if you'd like to hear more stories of everyday people taking back their power, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing that notification bell. There's strength in our stories, and we're all in this together.